At 16:18 hours on a Wednesday in late March, the dining room table had been cleared, leaving only a lined notebook, a box of colored pencils, and stack of photocopied maps arranged in neat piles. Outside, the late afternoon light had begun to flatten across the quiet residential street, reflecting off the windows of neighboring homes and muted foliage along the sidewalks. The child assigned to the task had been instructed to compile a school project requiring documentation of family history, including dates, locations, and occupational details across 2 generations. The assignment itself was routine, structured, and explicitly academic. It required care, accuracy, and adherence to chronology. As the child began transferring the details provided by his parents into the notebook, a small inconsistency became visible. One city name appeared twice in different forms, once with a regional qualifier and once without. The difference was minor, almost imperceptible, and might have been overlooked in any casual review. It was noticed only because the project demanded precision, verification, and clarity. Nothing about the act implied scrutiny. It was simply recorded as data. The routine continued without interruption. The house reflected no outward sign of irregularity. It was a conventional single-family residence, purchased through standard channels years prior, and furnished over time with gradual accumulation. The dining room, where the project was conducted, was multifunctional. It hosted routine administrative tasks, weekend maintenance, and scheduled family meals. Against one wall stood a metal filing cabinet, drawers labeled in black ink, utilities, insurance, taxes, medical. Inside, documents were filed chronologically, clipped rather than stapled, with no loose papers scattered. Adjacent bookshelves held a combination of technical manuals, general literature, and outdated travel guides with uneven wear along their spines. The significance of these details lies in the pattern of normalcy they establish. Intelligence work often depends less on concealment and more on the appearance of order. This home, orderly and predictable, provided a benign environment that would later conceal activity. The household functioned with procedural consistency, with no overt preparation for secrecy or tradecraft. The observer in this account, the child completing the assignment, had unrestricted access to the environment and materials. Questions were asked because they were required, and answers were recorded without interpretation. The notebook filled steadily with names, dates, arrows linking locations, and notes on occupations. When ambiguity arose, entries were corrected or rewritten for clarity rather than interrogated for truth. The child's role was passive and methodical, shaped by the requirements of the assignment rather than curiosity or suspicion. At this stage, the Cold War existed only as a historical backdrop, not as an active force in the household. Any significance embedded in the information provided by the parents remained dormant, unobserved, and untested. The project proceeded according to routine parameters, constrained by deadlines and organizational requirements, rather than analytical insight. The parents' daily routines were structured and predictable. Departures occurred within a 10-minute window each morning. Returns were punctual and consistently recorded in memory, rather than documented formally. Weekends followed an equally defined but altered rhythm, a mixture of errands, household maintenance, and controlled leisure. Reading materials arrived through subscription services and were carefully stored after use. Correspondence was opened at the same location in the evening, reviewed, and then filed or archived. Requests for occupational history were answered functionally, providing titles and generalized responsibilities rather than detailed procedures. The language used was stable across repetitions and contexts, standardized in form and content. While these behaviors were normal in isolation, they created a baseline of expectation that would later highlight minor deviations. The procedural consistency established an operational pattern whose significance was invisible without prolonged observation. As the child transcribed the information, minor adjustments began to accumulate. Dates were corrected and then restored. Residences were described first as permanent, then as temporary. Birthplaces shifted slightly in phrasing or description. These changes were internally logical, but their frequency created a pattern detectable over time. The notebook reflected these revisions with erasures, overwritten numerals, arrows redirecting timelines, and margin notes clarifying details. At this point, these entries were not interpreted as suspicious. They were recorded mechanically, as required by the assignment. In intelligence work, seemingly trivial revisions often mark the threshold between concealment and exposure. Recognition requires aggregation and comparison over repeated iterations. At this stage, the data was accumulating silently. Additional materials for the assignment were provided voluntarily by the parents. A box retrieved from a closet contained photographs, identity documents, and official forms retained long after their immediate relevance had passed. The child sorted through the contents, selecting items that appeared applicable to the project. Some documents carried stamps from long-defunct agencies. Others listed addresses inconsistent with contemporary maps. Photographs were formal and carefully labeled with dates in a consistent hand. None of these materials directly contradicted oral statements. Instead, they added texture and depth to the recorded information. Archives, even personal ones, contain meaning through both selection and omission. What is preserved, discarded, or duplicated often signals priorities, attention, or intention. At this stage, the significance of these selections remained latent, their implications unexamined. Daily life proceeded without interruption. Meals occurred on schedule, mornings followed established routes, and evenings concluded at predictable hours. The project advanced in a defined portion of the child's time, never encroaching on routine activities. Notes were reorganized, color-coded, and aligned for clarity and presentation. Maps were annotated with straight lines connecting points efficiently. These processes reflected instruction and method rather than inference or suspicion. The child's engagement remained procedural. The narrative emphasis is on this restraint because later events would appear inevitable. In reality, the project advanced slowly, constrained by deadlines rather than analytic intent. The first technical challenge emerged when the child attempted to consolidate all locations onto a single chronological timeline. Certain periods became densely packed, while others appeared unusually sparse. Travel coincided with employment in ways that required adjustments to visual representation. The child redrew scales, compressed years, and expanded intervals to accommodate overlapping events. These changes were executed without concern or alarm. They were technical solutions to structural inconsistencies, not indicators of intent or deception. Intelligence tradecraft often manifests in such structural anomalies, where routine documentation obscures operational detail. At this point, the notebook was fully formed, detailed, and coherent in appearance, yet silently accumulating data of future relevance. By the end of the week, the notebook contained a complete draft. It was organized, visually coherent, and thorough in scope. Only during preparation for the final presentation did the child pause to re-verify certain entries. Answers matched earlier information substantively, but varied slightly in phrasing. The minor discrepancies were noted and marked for later confirmation. At this stage, the routine remained unbroken. No suspicion had crystallized. No conclusions had been drawn. The only change was the meticulous recording of ordinary life with exceptional precision. The process of documentation, rather than intent or inquiry, marked the first stage of exposure. Routine had not been disrupted. It had only been observed and recorded. This quiet, methodical accumulation of data, structured around deadlines, timelines, and careful notation, forms the baseline of investigation that follows. No alarm had sounded. No irregularities had been flagged. Yet, through the act of recording, patterns and inconsistencies were captured in a format that could later be analyzed, verified, and cross-referenced. In intelligence terms, the slow aggregation of procedural detail often precedes recognition. At 16:18 hours on that late March afternoon, ordinary life had been documented in a way that would allow extraordinary conclusions to emerge over time. Nothing overt had been discovered. Everything had been noted. The child, unaware, had become the inadvertent chronicler of activities that would later be classified as operational tradecraft, even as the household itself appeared entirely normal. The transition from routine documentation to the emergence of suspicion occurred incrementally and imperceptibly. By the second week of the school project, the child, following the assignment's instructions, began cross-referencing dates, locations, and occupational information provided by the parents. Initially, these cross-checks were procedural, intended solely to ensure accuracy for the project. However, subtle irregularities began to accumulate. Travel dates that had appeared linear were occasionally inconsistent with other entries. Addresses listed in documents did not correspond to mapped locations. Minor temporal gaps emerged in the timeline, intervals of several weeks with no recorded activity. At first, these discrepancies were treated as clerical error, but when observed repeatedly, they began to form a recognizable pattern. The child, unaware of the implications, continued methodically documenting, unaware that the act of repetition was recording the very anomalies that would later trigger investigative attention. Observations were anchored in specific dates and times, often recorded automatically in the notebook. March 14th, for example, had an entry for a trip described as a business visit, yet the corresponding location appeared on a map several miles from any known workplace. April 3rd included a document labeled Official Correspondence, the contents of which reference cities in a manner inconsistent with the family's stated residence. The child noted these inconsistencies with simple notations, stars, arrows, and question marks, without judgment or interpretation. These symbols would later serve as points of reference for analysts, but were at the time mere reminders to review and confirm. The notebook had begun to accumulate a secondary layer of observation beyond the original assignment, not through curiosity or intent, but through careful attention to detail inherent in the project's requirements. Patterns emerged most clearly when cross-referencing travel with occupational descriptions. The parents' reported activities were consistent in duration but inconsistent in location. Short absences corresponded to long-distance entries in the notebook, suggesting a discrepancy between stated purpose and recorded destination. When the child aligned these entries on a map, it became apparent that multiple sequences overlapped or conflicted. The narration avoids interpretation. It does not suggest motive, only method. Intelligence work relies on recognizing such structural anomalies without assuming intent. It is the pattern itself that matters, not the emotion or explanation behind it. Over time, the repetition of these small irregularities generated an implicit tension within the documentation, a tension that remained unnoticed by the family, yet was palpable in the dataset being compiled. Observation extended beyond mere dates and locations. The child began noting micro-behaviors previously unremarked upon. The parents preferred written clarification over verbal explanation for queries. Certain questions prompted delayed or evasive responses, followed by written documentation. Documents were stored in precise locations, sometimes in envelopes labeled with codes or numerical sequences that did not correspond to ordinary filing methods. The child recorded these anomalies in the notebook, maintaining neutral descriptions, envelope with numbers, not dates, label does not match map entry, document placed in top drawer, not bottom. Each notation was procedural, without judgment. These micro-details would later serve as key indicators in the federal analysis of operational tradecraft, but at the time, they were simply part of the child's methodical record-keeping. The child's monitoring expanded to include timing and duration of routine activities. Departure times, once noted for the purpose of aligning the project's timeline, were now carefully recorded in minutes. The parents' movements, while consistent, occasionally showed brief deviations, errands that lasted longer than recorded, or absences that coincided with unusual periods of communication. These were documented with precise timestamps, down to the minute when feasible. The cumulative effect of these entries was an increasingly granular dataset, one that reflected behavior over time rather than isolated events. At this stage, no deliberate analysis occurred. Observation remained passive, embedded in the structure of the school project. Yet, from a procedural perspective, the child was unknowingly generating the primary data necessary for later investigative procedures. Patterns extended to document handling and storage. Multiple drafts of forms were preserved rather than discarded. Corrections were overwritten with careful precision. Photographs were labeled sequentially, yet some dates conflicted with the content depicted. The child recorded these inconsistencies in a systematic manner. Photo date differs from calendar entry. Document revised twice, no explanation given. Such notations were neutral, descriptive, and devoid of assumption. These records would later allow federal analysts to reconstruct timelines and detect deviations indicative of tradecraft. The tension inherent in the dataset arose not from overtly suspicious behavior, but from repeated small anomalies accumulating over time, creating a measurable pattern of irregularity. By late March, the child's attention had shifted subtly. Observation became more intentional. While still framed as part of the assignment, the act of recording now included verification. Entries were cross-checked against previous pages, maps, and documents. Multiple sources were compared, and discrepancies were noted with visual markers. These methods of cross-referencing mirrored basic analytic procedures used in professional intelligence work. Though the child had no awareness of tradecraft principles, the systematic attention to temporal, geographic, and procedural detail produced a dataset that closely approximated initial surveillance records. Patterns of travel, Document handling and behavioral consistency or deviation were cataloged incrementally, creating a framework for later formal investigation. The next stage involved alignment and synthesis of anomalies. The child began drawing connecting lines on maps, noting overlapping travel, temporal gaps, and repeated patterns of activity. Sequences that had initially appeared isolated now displayed correlation. Small irregularities, when plotted over time, suggested intervals of activity that were otherwise unexplained. These observations were recorded neutrally, without interpretation, allowing a pattern to emerge organically. Intelligence protocols emphasize exactly this method. Data aggregation precedes analysis. Recognition occurs through comparison and alignment, not speculation. The child's process, dictated by the academic project, unknowingly mirrored professional pattern recognition techniques used in counterintelligence. Behavioral micropatterns reinforced the emerging suspicion. Written documentation was consistently prioritized over verbal explanation. Material was stored with careful precision, sometimes in unusual locations. Minor deviations in timing and sequence were repeatedly observed. The child's notations, consisting of symbols, highlights, and arrows, created a visual record of consistency and divergence. These were subtle signals, invisible to the casual observer, yet highly informative in a procedural context. The narration emphasizes the methodical accumulation of these observations as they form the basis for escalation. No alarm or judgment was present. The process remained neutral and investigative in orientation. By early April, the child's notebook had grown into a comprehensive repository of both routine documentation and emerging anomalies. Each entry recorded dates, durations, locations, and procedural detail. Inconsistencies were highlighted systematically. Patterns were noted visually and chronologically. The data was rich, precise, and structured in a manner suitable for professional review. At this stage, the project was no longer solely academic. It had become a framework for observation, with the child functioning as an inadvertent chronicler of subtle irregularities. The tension of escalation existed not in immediate threat, but in the aggregation of data that, if interpreted by trained analysts, could reveal operational behavior. The final phase of this section involves the implicit recognition of anomaly. The child, preparing for the project's presentation, revisited entries requiring verification. Discrepancies in phrasing, location, and date were noted and marked for review. At this point, suspicion had not fully formed in conscious terms, but the pattern was sufficiently consistent to allow inference. Routine documentation had begun to intersect with subtle irregularity, forming a measurable baseline for subsequent investigation. The act of observation, rooted in the ordinary requirements of a school assignment, had escalated naturally into an emergent recognition of inconsistency. Ordinary life had been documented with extraordinary precision, producing a latent record of activity that would later inform formal federal review. The section closes on this threshold, the transition from passive recording to active awareness. The child continued completing the assignment, unaware that the structured documentation, attention to temporal and geographic detail, and methodical notation of minor irregularities constituted the first stage of escalation. No dramatic event had occurred. No confrontation had taken place. The ordinary had quietly intersected with the anomalous. Over time, these observations would prove critical. The dataset was now sufficient to support future inquiry, but at this stage, it remained a product of routine, structure, and procedural diligence. Suspicion existed only in potential, encoded in timestamps, deviations, and careful notation, awaiting interpretation by analysts beyond the household. The first tangible intersection between civilian observation and formal counterintelligence occurred in early April, approximately 2 weeks after the child had completed the initial draft of the school project. While reviewing the compiled notebook and ancillary materials, the child discovered a folder that had not previously been examined. The folder contained several documents that were technically mundane, letters, maps, and administrative forms, but exhibited characteristics inconsistent with standard domestic use. Stamps from foreign offices appeared alongside numerical codes that did not correspond to local administrative systems. Addresses and city names were repeated with subtle variations. At this stage, the child did not understand the significance of these differences. The observation remained procedural, constrained by the requirements of the assignment rather than interpretive analysis. Yet the act of retrieval itself marked the first step toward formal interception. The folder was removed carefully from its storage location, and its contents were laid out sequentially for review. Each document was dated, cataloged, and compared against previously recorded entries. Travel and occupational data were cross-referenced with the calendar and photographic material already compiled in the notebook. Small inconsistencies became immediately apparent. Some entries included dates that overlapped with periods of known absence, while others referenced locations inconsistent with publicly available maps. Photographs were labeled with sequential dates, yet depicted settings that could not be reconciled with the stated residence or travel records. The child's annotations, which had previously been internal reminders for clarity, now assumed a secondary function. They created an organized index for subsequent evaluation. The compilation process remained neutral, descriptive, and methodical. The next phase involved transfer of the material to authority, a step that occurred without immediate awareness of its potential significance. The child presented the documents and notebook to a school administrator as part of the project's review process. The administrator, observing the volume of material, noted minor irregularities in dates and locations. These were reported in accordance with standard procedures for unusual findings in student-submitted research. The chain of custody was informal initially, but later formalized when federal representatives were contacted. Documentation was handled according to protocol. Materials were logged, assigned reference numbers, and transported securely. No actions were taken against the household at this stage. Observation remained strictly analytical, limited to recording and verifying inconsistencies. Federal agencies, including the counterintelligence divisions of the FBI and associated analysis teams, initiated preliminary review upon receipt of the materials. Analysts began by examining structural characteristics of the documents, format, markings, numerical coding, and anomalies in geographic references. Attention was directed toward repeated patterns across multiple entries, particularly those involving locations that appeared strategically relevant for intelligence purposes. The review was methodical, following established protocols for the identification of potential foreign agent activity. Analysts did not make assumptions regarding intent. Rather, they cataloged discrepancies, validated sources, and verified consistency of entries with known public records. The materials were assigned secure storage locations, and access was limited to personnel with requisite clearance. Background reconstruction proceeded systematically. The child's notebook and supporting documents provided the basis for a chronological map of activity. Investigators examined employment histories, travelogues, educational records, and residency claims. Each entry was validated against independent sources, including municipal records, publicly available directories, and correspondence with foreign institutions where applicable. Inconsistencies identified by the child were confirmed and extended by professional analysis, revealing patterns of travel and document management that cannot be explained by ordinary routine. Analysts noted temporal overlaps, repeated location references, and coded notations consistent with low-level intelligence activity. At this stage, evidence remained circumstantial, yet sufficiently robust to merit ongoing observation. Stakes escalated when analysts identified a combination of behavioral and material indicators consistent with clandestine operational behavior. These included repeated adjustments in travel documentation, careful preservation of historical correspondence, the presence of numerical and letter coding in otherwise mundane forms, and repeated archival of duplicates. Each element was cataloged with timestamps, source references, and internal notations for analytical review. Analysts emphasized neutrality. The objective was to confirm whether anomalies indicated operational intent rather than coincidence. The accumulation of these indicators, however, suggested that the household's activities warranted controlled surveillance and the initiation of formal counterintelligence monitoring. Federal involvement transitioned from preliminary review to active monitoring. Analysts established discrete observation points and began compiling movement and correspondence patterns without alerting household members. This process involved documenting departures, arrivals, and the handling of sensitive materials. Access to telephone and mail records was obtained through legal channels. Analysts maintained meticulous logs, recording time, duration, location, and context for every observed activity. The child's prior documentation served as a reference frame, providing baseline behavioral data against which ongoing observations could be compared. Surveillance was procedural, designed to identify patterns of activity and assess potential operational impact without initiating confrontation. Evidence handling followed strict protocols to preserve integrity and admissibility. Documents and materials collected were cataloged, photographed, and stored in secure facilities. Analysts maintained redundant records, noting date of collection, source, and custody chain. All processing occurred under conditions designed to minimize contamination or loss. Observed behaviors were recorded contemporaneously in analytic logs, emphasizing temporal precision and geographic specificity. The household itself remained unaware of the scrutiny. Operations were designed to balance the need for data acquisition with the preservation of cover, a principle fundamental to successful counterintelligence practice. By late April, sufficient corroborating evidence had accumulated to suggest that anomalies were not coincidental. Repeated deviations in documentation, travel, and archival behavior had been confirmed by multiple sources. Analysts noted a consistent pattern in procedural handling, timing, and documentation, reflecting methods commonly associated with intelligence operations. While the child remained unaware, the materials they had collected had become integral to the formal investigation. The notebook, photographs, and ancillary documents now served as primary reference points, linking observable behavior to potential operational conduct. Analysts emphasized methodical assessment over speculative judgment, preserving the integrity of the dataset while planning the next operational phase. The section closes on the threshold of operational escalation. Civilian observation, initially intended for academic purposes, had intersected with federal intelligence protocols. Evidence, previously neutral and ordinary, had been recognized as potentially indicative of clandestine activity. Analysts, having validated patterns and identified procedural anomalies, prepared for expanded surveillance and formal investigation. The household remained unaltered externally, maintaining routine appearances while an internal evaluation unfolded. The intersection of civilian documentation with professional intelligence methodology marked the point at which procedural observation transitioned to controlled federal intervention, establishing a foundation for subsequent surveillance, analysis, and investigative action. At this stage, the child's role receded from active observation to archival relevance. The notebook and documents were preserved as primary source material. Analysts continued to accumulate data, correlating it with independent verification channels and surveillance logs. Every deviation, every micro-detail, every timestamped movement became part of a structured record designed to inform operational decisions. The process emphasized patience, attention to detail, and procedural rigor. No arrests had occurred, and the parents remained unaware of the attention directed toward them. The documentation provided by the child had catalyzed federal involvement without immediate confrontation, demonstrating the subtle mechanics through which civilian observation can trigger formal intelligence processes. The critical outcome of this section is the establishment of a verified, methodically documented dataset. The notebook, once a school project, had become the conduit for formal counterintelligence assessment. Anomalies previously unnoticed were now confirmed and extended by professional analysis. The procedural rigor applied in this phase laid the groundwork for subsequent surveillance operations, ensuring that evidence would remain intact and usable in further investigative or legal procedures. By the end of this stage, civilian observation had transitioned fully into federal oversight, creating the conditions necessary for methodical evaluation of operational behavior, identification of potential assets, and the controlled acquisition of actionable intelligence. Following the confirmation of anomalous patterns and procedural inconsistencies, federal counterintelligence agencies transitioned into sustained surveillance and analytic observation. The operation began with the establishment of discrete observation points around the household and frequently visited locations. Vehicles were strategically positioned to avoid detection while providing comprehensive views of ingress and egress. Time logs were established to record departures, arrivals, and durations of travel. Each movement was cataloged with precise timestamps, including minute-by-minute records of when the parents left the residence, the routes taken, stops made en route, and the approximate time of return. Observation was continuous but procedural, emphasizing systematic data collection over interpretation. The child's previous documentation served as a baseline against which observed behavior could be compared and verified. Route analysis revealed recurring patterns in travel. Short excursions often coincided with errands, yet several trips deviated from expected destinations, terminating instead at locations previously identified in the documents provided by the child. Dead drop locations were hypothesized based on patterns of brief stops at unremarkable public areas, including post office boxes, park benches, and utility access points. Surveillance teams recorded each approach, departure, and handling of objects without alerting household members. Observers noted the frequency and timing of each stop, emphasizing routine repetition and consistency in duration. These operational behaviors were consistent with low-level intelligence activities designed to avoid detection while maintaining reliable communication or material transfer. Signal and correspondence monitoring was conducted in parallel. Analysts collected and verified incoming and outgoing communications, cross-referencing observed movements with telephone records, mailing information, and other interceptable data. Analysts identified patterns consistent with coded or scheduled communication, aligning these with the documented travel and procedural habits of the household. No intercepts were dramatized. Rather, analysts recorded the correlation of timing, location, and content, producing a composite operational map of activity. Deviations from expected patterns were logged for further analysis, forming a comprehensive dataset linking temporal and geographic behavior to potential intelligence operations. Every step followed established protocols to maintain legal compliance and minimize risk to both the household and personnel. As surveillance continued, analysts sought to confirm the role of each parent as an operational asset. Observed behaviors, including document handling, coded labeling, and specific travel sequences, aligned with low-level intelligence activity. Analysts cataloged these actions with reference to prior anomalies identified by the child's documentation. The cumulative evidence supported the classification of the household members as participants in an intelligence operation rather than independent anomalies. Each observation was recorded in detail: time, date, duration, location, and activity description. Analysts also noted environmental factors such as weather, lighting, and pedestrian traffic to contextualize behavior and ensure accuracy in interpretation. The next stage involved controlled interaction with materials previously collected. Documents and photographs were retrieved from secure storage for analysis. Analysts examined stamps, labels, coding sequences, and cross-referenced them with observed travel patterns and historical timelines. Minor discrepancies in document labeling and chronological alignment were systematically documented. Photographs depicting various locations were compared with travel and timeline data to identify correlations. This process was conducted methodically, with all findings entered into analytical databases to produce a comprehensive view of operational behavior. Each correlation was verified through independent sources when possible, ensuring a high degree of confidence in the conclusions drawn. Identification of the household as operational assets allowed for targeted planning of further counterintelligence measures. Analysts mapped anticipated movements based on prior surveillance, estimated potential contacts, and identified probable communication or drop points. This planning phase emphasized patience, precision, and adherence to procedural rigor. Analysts avoided speculative inference, instead relying on empirical observation and recorded anomalies. Each anticipated movement was documented in advance, and contingency plans were prepared to ensure operational integrity in the event of deviation. The emphasis remained on observation, verification, and documentation rather than confrontation or immediate intervention. The arrest and confiscation phase was executed with procedural care. Federal agents approached the household without alarm or visible confrontation. All confiscated documents, correspondence, and physical materials were cataloged with meticulous attention to chain of custody. Items were photographed, inventoried, and stored in secure facilities, preserving evidentiary integrity for subsequent analysis and potential legal proceedings. Observations of the parents' immediate reactions were noted neutrally, with descriptive records emphasizing timing, physical movement, and behavior without interpretive or emotive commentary. This approach maintained procedural objectivity while ensuring that all evidence remained intact and admissible. Interrogation followed standard counterintelligence methodology, emphasizing structured questioning, verification of known timelines, and clarification of anomalies. Analysts summarized operational behavior without dramatization, identifying recruitment methods, motivations, and operational tasks. The parents disclosed participation in intelligence activities with ideological and contractual components, confirming procedural patterns observed during surveillance. Analysts documented these admissions alongside corroborating material, producing an integrated operational profile. The interrogation highlighted recruitment during early adulthood, assignment of operational responsibilities, and adherence to protocols designed to minimize risk and detection. The parents' methods, motivations, and limitations were detailed analytically, allowing federal agencies to fully understand the scope of operational participation. Throughout the investigation, the handler associated with the household remained partially identified but elusive. Analysts inferred the handler's presence through indirect means, coded communications, schedule alignments, and procedural consistency observed in material transfers. Attempts to identify the handler physically were unsuccessful, and jurisdictional limitations prevented direct intervention. The handler's influence, however, was evident in the structure, timing, and methods observed in the household. Analysts documented all inferred interactions, noting probable objectives, coordination patterns, and operational hierarchy. Despite incomplete identification, the profile provided sufficient information to contextualize the household's behavior within a broader intelligence framework. Finally, analysts conducted operational assessment to evaluate potential impact and continued risk. Each observed activity, documented anomaly, and verified correlation was integrated into a comprehensive report. The household was classified as a low to mid-level asset with operational methods consistent with long-term intelligence collection designed to remain covert. Analysts emphasized unresolved elements, including unconfirmed contacts and the handler's continued anonymity. Surveillance and documentation protocols remained in place to monitor residual activity while ensuring the household's continued routine appeared undisturbed externally. All observations were recorded with precision, maintaining temporal and geographic specificity, and highlighting the procedural rigor necessary in Cold War counterintelligence operations. The section concludes with the full integration of surveillance, analytic review, and controlled interrogation. Observed behaviors were cross-referenced with the child's prior documentation, producing a verified operational profile. All evidence was secured and cataloged, while the household remained unaware of the complete scope of observation. The handler, though partially inferred, remained at large, emphasizing the persistent ambiguity of counterintelligence work. Analysts maintained procedural neutrality, focusing on the accurate reconstruction of behavior, documentation of operational sequences, and careful preservation of evidence. At this point, the foundation was established for subsequent operational actions, including attempts to intercept, contain, or neutralize external contacts, forming the bridge to the next phase of investigative escalation. Following the completion of surveillance, document analysis, and controlled interrogation, federal counterintelligence agencies planned a targeted operation intended to intercept external contacts and potentially apprehend the handler. The operation was designed to be cautious, precise, and procedural, avoiding unnecessary exposure of the household while testing the integrity of the external network. Analysts relied on previously collected travel patterns, timestamps, coded correspondence, and behavioral observation to predict locations where material exchange or communication might occur. The operation emphasized operational security, ensuring that agents remained undetected while preserving the appearance of routine life. Every detail of timing, route, and expected action was documented and logged in advance, creating a controlled framework for engagement. The initial phase of the operation involved surveillance of predicted dead-drop locations and probable points of contact. Vehicles were positioned at safe distances, cameras and recording equipment were calibrated, and temporal windows for observation were strictly defined. Analysts documented each movement of the household and the surrounding environment, noting environmental conditions such as light, weather, and pedestrian traffic. Observed behaviors were recorded with precise timestamps and geographic coordinates. In parallel, communications identified as coded or scheduled were monitored to detect the handler's involvement. The operation maintained a strict emphasis on procedural observation rather than interpretation or speculative engagement, consistent with counterintelligence methodology. Despite careful planning, the operation encountered its first complication when predicted activity at a dead-drop site did not align with actual events. The anticipated exchange did not occur within the scheduled time frame. Vehicles that were expected to arrive did not appear. No observable contact occurred at the location. Analysts recorded the absence of activity, noting exact timestamps and environmental conditions. Alternative explanations were considered: miscalculated timing, deliberate misdirection by the handler, or changes in operational protocol. Analysts documented all potential variables, maintaining neutrality and avoiding assumptions. This unexpected divergence emphasized the inherent unpredictability in operational networks and highlighted the limitations of predictive modeling, even with extensive surveillance data. Subsequent attempts to locate the handler through inferred movement patterns and communication sequences were similarly inconclusive. Analysts cross-referenced timestamps, travelogues, and material handling patterns to identify potential meeting points, yet each led to ambiguity rather than resolution. Temporary contacts observed in surrounding areas were found to be unrelated. Vehicles and individuals noted in prior patterns did not match current expectations. Every deviation was logged, analyzed, and incorporated into operational records, emphasizing the procedural rigor of intelligence work. The handler remained elusive, maintaining operational anonymity despite repeated attempts to establish direct contact or interception. The operation's partial failure underscored the persistent challenge of external asset management. While household members had been identified and their operational methods confirmed, the handler's continued anonymity represented a critical gap in the intelligence chain. Analysts documented this uncertainty, highlighting the absence of conclusive evidence regarding the handler's identity, location, or methods. Surveillance protocols were adjusted to accommodate ongoing observation, balancing the need for continued intelligence gathering with the practical limitations of human and technological resources. Every observation, whether confirming or negating prior assumptions, was recorded systematically, emphasizing transparency and analytic integrity. Legal proceedings were initiated for the household members identified as operational assets. Evidence compiled through surveillance, document analysis, and interrogation was presented according to procedural and evidentiary standards. Charges focused on violations related to foreign intelligence activity and unauthorized document handling. Sentencing and administrative outcomes were documented with exact dates, durations, and procedural references. Analysts maintained detailed records of case proceedings, integrating them with operational logs to produce a comprehensive account of investigative findings. The household members' cooperation during the process was noted and incorporated into procedural assessment. Despite legal resolution for the assets, the handler remained beyond reach, unaccounted for in legal or operational documentation. Post-operation analysis emphasized unresolved elements of the case. Analysts reviewed timelines, surveillance data, and communication sequences to evaluate potential alternate pathways for intelligence transfer. Each element of uncertainty, the handler's identity, potential undiscovered contacts, and unverified communications, was highlighted in analytic reports. These unresolved threads were categorized for future monitoring, acknowledging the limitations inherent in counterintelligence operations. The operation, while partially successful in confirming household participation and procedural methodology, had failed to neutralize the external agent network fully. This failure underscored the enduring ambiguity and complexity of intelligence work, particularly during the Cold War, where layered secrecy and operational caution created persistent uncertainty. Procedural lessons were extracted from the operation. Analysts emphasized the importance of baseline observation, careful cross-referencing of civilian documentation, and the value of incremental data accumulation. The child's original project, once a simple academic assignment, had initiated a chain of observation that facilitated federal intervention. Observation, documentation, and procedural verification proved essential in bridging the gap between civilian discovery and formal counterintelligence engagement. Analysts highlighted how slow-burn surveillance, combined with precise record-keeping and methodical review, allowed partial reconstruction of operational methods even without direct confrontation. These findings informed future counterintelligence protocols and reinforced the principle that latent observation often precedes actionable intelligence. The final stage of the operation involved the continued monitoring of residual activity. Analysts maintained logs of movements, correspondence, and material handling by the household while noting the absence of direct engagement with the handler. Surveillance points were rotated to reduce predictability, and all observations were cataloged with timestamps, environmental conditions, and detailed procedural notes. The handler, though indirectly observed through behavioral inference, remained unapprehended. Analysts documented this sustained ambiguity as an inherent feature of the operational environment, emphasizing that the unknown presence of a handler introduces persistent uncertainty into counterintelligence operations. All findings were archived for future reference, forming part of a comprehensive record of the operation's outcomes. The operation concluded without definitive resolution of all network elements. While household members faced legal consequences and operational behavior had been mapped and analyzed, the handler evaded detection and continued beyond the reach of jurisdiction. Analysts maintained detailed records of the incomplete interception, noting operational gaps, inferred contacts, and the procedural limitations encountered. The Cold War context framed this outcome. Ambiguity, unresolved threads, and the persistence of covert networks were expected, and success was measured by incremental insight rather than total neutralization. The narrative emphasizes the subtleties of operational oversight, the precision of surveillance, and the necessity of cautious, methodical engagement. In closing, the case exemplifies the intersection of civilian observation, federal counterintelligence procedure, and operational ambiguity. The child's school project initiated an unintentional surveillance sequence that revealed structural patterns of intelligence activity. Household members were identified, operational methods documented, and legal processes executed. The handler, however, remained partially inferred and operationally active beyond detection. Analysts emphasize the importance of documentation, incremental observation, and methodological neutrality throughout the investigation. The lingering uncertainty, procedural complexity, and unresolved elements highlight the enduring opacity of Cold War intelligence work. Routine life, methodical observation, and procedural diligence intersected to produce actionable insight, yet complete resolution remained beyond reach. The operation's outcomes underscore a fundamental principle. In Cold War counterintelligence, knowledge is provisional, clarity is limited, and ambiguity persists.